Hi, I'm Amanda Morgan, and this is Not Just Cute, the podcast, where we discuss all kinds of topics to help bridge the gap that exists between what we know and what we do in early childhood education. We're starting conversations with academics, authors, decision makers, educators, and parents so that together we can improve the quality of early childhood education, while at the same time protecting and respecting the childhood experience. I've been on a bit of a deep dive into the science of reading. If you're wanting to catch up, you can find more in episodes 56 and 57, as well as a post that will be linked in the show notes today. And with all of that context and information, I'm excited finally to share with you some ideas and perspectives from Malia Hollowell, the author of The Science of Reading in Action, and the creator of the site Play-Doh to Play-Toh. She's a national board certified educator who's helping to put the science of reading into action with playful, hands-on experiences. Her book, website, and Instagram are full of fantastic examples and resources. Her primary focus is grades K-2, but depending on where your littles are skill-wise, there are loads of great activities that are appropriate for pre-K as well. Before we jump in, a quick reminder that the Why We Play letters will help you jumpstart important conversations in your learning community about the importance and power of play in your early childhood setting, including how play helps to support literacy. People don't value what they don't understand. If you want to help parents and colleagues understand the value of play, the Why We Play letters were created just for you. Learn more and grab a free sample letter at notjustcute.com/whyweplay. You can find this episode's show notes, which will be full of links, tidbits, and resources, including Malia's fantastic phonological awareness warm-ups for free. Find those at notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 58. If you've been wondering how to add more intentional, playful, science-based elements into your literacy practice, you're in the right place. Let's jump in. Malia, thank you so much for talking with me today. There's so much that I want to hear from you.
There is so much for us to talk about. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm excited. The first thing that I always like to ask people, though, is before we jump into the meat of what we want to talk about, is just your story of how you got to where you are, your background, both behind this book that you've written that we've talked about, but even bigger than that, just your background that's brought you to do what you do more broadly in your work right now with children.
Well, I started teaching back in 2003, and I was in it to win it. I was determined to help every single child in my class soar. And I noticed really early on that our literacy curriculum was not serving a lot of the kids in my classroom. They were leaving, I was teaching second grade at the time, and they were leaving my second grade classroom below grade level. And obviously, that is just not acceptable. So right. I started looking for some solutions, and I happened to stumble across this curriculum called Words Their Way, which was pretty new in the field. And it basically outlined the order that we should teach phonics skills. So you should start with these letter sounds and then build on to these letter sounds and so on. And when I started implementing it, I noticed a big difference in my students' results. So I thought, well, there's something here. It feels like I need to add more to my lesson plan. So I spent the next 10 years researching different programs, different lesson plans and activities. And I had a really strong phonics game. I was soaring with those kids, but I still found like there were some kids who just were continuing to struggle. So that there has to be more here. And that's about the time that I first heard the term science of reading. And I will never forget it, because I went home and I opened up Amazon and I typed in science of reading book, because I was expecting that something would pop up, and nothing popped into my browser. So I realized very quickly that the science of reading is not a literacy curriculum. It is not a political argument. It is not another pendulum swing. It's just 70 years of research that scientists have done on how our brain actually learns how to read. And there is so much that we can learn from this. But the struggle, of course, is that it's a blessing and a curse. 70 years of research is a lot of information. Yeah. That is a lot of journal articles. That is a lot of brain scans. So I have taken all of that information and I've boiled it down to really easy to understand terms, really easy to understand concepts, so that teachers can start understanding what this says and also start implementing it in their classroom right away. So we can help all of our kids get that big reading growth that we want.
Yeah. So then all of that research, was that before or after you started blogging? We both started in the early eras of blogging, and we were just talking about the name of your blog, and I don't think it carries as well verbally as it does in print, but it's Plato to Plato. So Plato that you play with to Plato, the philosopher. Where did that fit into this journey of exploring reading specifically?
So I started, yes, you and I are blogging OGs. I started Plato to Plato when I was really strengthening my phonics pieces. So I didn't find out about the science of reading until after Emily Hanford wrote her article that shook the education world back in 2018. She wrote this op-ed piece in the New York Times that basically called out the education system for not paying attention to all of this research that was being done on how brains learn to read. And she called the education system to the carpet and said, you guys, we have so much information, and yet our literacy curriculums, our teacher trainings are not passing this on to the people who need it most, our teachers who are on the front line. I was blogging in the dark without any of this information at my fingertips. And now I've seen the light, which is really great. So I've actually had to go back through many of my blog posts from those early years and update them because it wasn't the full picture. There's so much more that we could be doing for kids.
And there is so much. And like you said, that can be really overwhelming to take it all in, because we're talking decades and decades of both the research that you're talking about, but also the practices that we've had that we all have to go back and re-examine. And like we do with anything, right? What do we keep? What do we get rid of? So before we jump into some of that, you touched on this pendulum swing. And I think that's a lot of what makes talking about literacy, especially in early childhood, really tricky, because we have seen these big swings, both on the side of seeing that some of the practices are not developmentally appropriate, right? That there's a lot of pressure and practices that aren't right for our youngest learners. And we're pushing it down, pushing this pressure down and expectations down where they don't belong. But then on the other side, I've seen places where people are almost avoidant of literacy because they don't want to be in the other camp, right? And so they, almost avoid the idea of reading at younger ages. So can you give a little background? Should anyone be unfamiliar with those or think there's only one side to that swing? Can you maybe give a little bit of a background of maybe what that's looked like or where it's come from? And then just advice on how somebody who's in early childhood can take these arguments that are still out there, right? On various edges or extremes of this argument, how they can take that and find the right balance for the young children that they're teaching.
Absolutely. Pendulum swings are exhausting. That's the real reality of it, because they require you to completely overhaul the way that you teach, the look of your classroom, the way that you lay out your lesson plans. There's just so much that has come into play in each of these big pendulum swings that we've seen in our teaching community. And so I hope that teachers know that I sympathize with them, because I've lived through them as well. In the 1970s, the primary focus was on phonics instruction. And so teachers were really encouraged to make sure that every lesson, every literacy lesson included direct instruction on the letters and the sounds that those letters made. And that continued for about 15 years. And then we saw a switch where we were really encouraged to use whole language instruction. And that was focused on teaching kids whole words. So rather than teaching them the sounds that individual letters made and helping them combine those sounds to make a word like k, n, we were told you just need to teach them the word can, have them memorize it, and then go on their merry way to the next word. Well, then in the early 2000s, we saw another pendulum swing, and there was this thought that we could be balanced. We could have both phonics and whole language and create this beautiful utopia, this Disneyland experience for kids where they're getting a little bit of both. But we don't have to teach phonics every day, and we don't have to teach whole language every day. We can kind of dabble in what feels good to us. The most important thing is to just put good books in kids' hands, because they're going to be so motivated to figure out what those words on the page actually say that they're going to want to learn how to read. And that's all it's going to take. And for some kids, that worked. That strategy worked. But for a lot of kids, they continued to struggle. And now we are at a place where we have 67% of our fourth graders in the United States right now who are reading below grade level. And as we know, as research has shown us, that leads to a lifetime of struggles. And so it's just not okay. We now have the information we need to do better. And so it's our responsibility as teachers to learn this new information and put it in place. So the thing I love most about the science of reading is that it's not a pendulum swing. I feel like we can finally take the pendulum and burn it, throw it out the window. We can stop arguing because it's not about what we philosophically think is best for kids. It's really about going to the research, looking at the brain scans. What is more effective, teaching tool A or teaching tool B? What is more effective, teaching strategy A or teaching strategy B? And just constantly using the strategy that is most brain friendly for kids, doing what's right for kids.
And it's interesting, as you mentioned, there's been that, well, the statistic that you mentioned, was it 67% of fourth graders?
Yes.
And I think that alone is striking, but I think it's also interesting and causes us to think about this, is that number, while it's also very low, also reflects, from what I've read, that we had made some gains over a few decades and then it dropped again. In fact, I think some of the headlines essentially say we've lost decades worth of gains because of the disruptions of COVID. And I think part of the concern then is this panic, right, to reclaim and make progress. But sometimes in the panic, we don't make the best choices about the practices that we use. And so recognizing that it took 20 years to get there and it took a few years to regress, that we don't know how many years it's going to take to make that progress, and to make sure that we're doing it using the means that are best for children. And like you said, taking the research that we have, we know so much about how children learn and grow. We need to make sure that that's what's implemented in the environments where they are, that we're not just panicking and pressuring and having a reflexive reaction, but that it's measured. So I'm curious, as you started this research, really digging into the science that is there about how we learn to read, what were some of the things that really surprised you, or that you think would surprise other people about reading, these assumptions that we have that just turn out to not be supported by the science?
The biggest thing that surprised me was that our literacy curriculums and teacher trainings were not science of reading aligned in most cases. That to me was actually heartbreaking to discover that. I almost felt deceived, and I felt shame as a teacher that I'd used these strategies for so many years with so many classes of my students. And now I was realizing that, oh my gosh, I could have been doing so much more for them if I just had known that there was something better out there. So that was the biggest shock for me. Other things that kind of came to mind were that you have to double check your sources. A lot of times we hear people say things like, this is research-based, or this is science of reading aligned, and it's actually not. So in a lot of cases, Instagram does not always get it right. So you just have to do your due diligence. And if you're uncertain, ask, say, what is the source of this suggestion? And they should be able to very quickly give you a link to a journal article that they used, or 5 journal articles that they used in order to make that recommendation.
That is a soapbox for me as well, that research-based in and of itself, that, I could talk too long about that, but just the idea that sometimes what we see has the stamp of research-based really is stretching and twisting from where it really originated. And that, like you said, check those sources, check how things were measured, research-based, by whom, to do what. There's just so much more than a simple stamp of research-based. So that's a great piece of advice, to really check those sources and look into that. So when we talk about, okay, we now need to reevaluate how we teach reading. And I think you hit on that feeling of almost guilt. And I think it's important for us to recognize that, like you said, those practices helped a lot of children, right? So we do the best with what we know. And then, as Maya Angelou said, when we know better, we do better. And so we want to take this growing body of information and help people to be more empowered to do even better each day. So as we look at that, what are some of those roadblocks that you've seen? As you said, we all reflect on our own practice. And as we do, we're going to see some of these things crop up that we could do better. So what do those roadblocks look like that you've found, especially in early childhood classrooms? And how could we do better there?
One of the biggest ones is that we envision that a switch is going to require a lot of time, a lot of energy, and a lot of lamination cutting. It does not have to. So phonological awareness is a really great example of that. So I always think of phonological awareness. I focus on that first part of the word fawn, that first syllable, and it means sound. So when we're focusing on phonological awareness, we're really helping students hear the sounds in words. And those could be big sound chunks like a whole word or even a whole syllable, or it could be very small sounds like an individual letter sound, k, at. So all of that is under the same umbrella of phonological awareness. And when we think about helping kids learn phonological awareness, the great news is that because it's completely auditory and it just involves hearing, we don't need fancy centers. We don't need to cut out a million little manipulative pieces. We can just practice it by having kids play with words. So we can say something like, change the k in cat to b. What is the new word? Bat. Or we could have them come up with rhyming. We could play with rhyming. We could do all kinds of things, and it's all auditory. There is no prep involved.
I think one of the fun things with teaching phonological awareness to teachers is often you see this room of teachers that kind of have, for many of them, they're like, this is the first time I've heard this huge word and I don't know what we're talking about. And it looks intimidating. And then when you explain that it is, like you said, just playing with sounds, and you start to point out all the ways that they are already doing it when it's, whether they're singing songs or doing nursery rhymes or reading silly, books or playing silly games, mystery words, those types of things, they start to realize, oh, I'm doing those things. They are familiar things. It's not laminating and cutting. It's not worksheets, that it is accessible and familiar to them already. It's just the awareness that is new, and how recognizing how powerful it is and how important that it is to use that. And there's something I like to tell teachers. I'm not trying to give them more to do because there's plenty to do, but to help them bring more awareness and intentionality to what they're doing so that they can see that these simple, fun things that they're already doing are building phonological awareness. So if we can, as teachers, become more aware of that and use them more strategically, we're going to help students so much more. And like you said, it doesn't require buying a bunch of new things or putting in a complete restructuring. It's the awareness of what it is that children need and how we can bring what we're already doing and do it a little bit better. So what are some other, when you talked before about having these strategies, so phonological awareness is one. What are some of those other pieces that are too often missing in early childhood classrooms? In addition to, I know phonological awareness is a big one. You can talk about that for a whole hour.
We could. So I would say phonological awareness, we need to be practicing it every day. Another one is phonics. When kids are ready, and in some early childhood classrooms, they may not be ready for that yet. So definitely use your best professional judgment on this, but adding phonics into your daily lessons is great too. And then another one is orthographic mapping. And I'll explain that term in just a second, but I want to tell you a quick little story. So my daughter, I have 3 kids, and my youngest daughter came home one day and she had a baggie filled with sight word cards. And this was before I understood the research. So I was determined to help her memorize these sight words by the end of the week when they were going to have this test. And so she was going through the stack, and every day we would practice. And come Friday, she could maybe recognize 2, but most of those words were just her guessing, and she happened to guess correctly. What I now know is that we can help students learn sight words much more efficiently. In fact, some research is showing that it's up to 10 times more quickly, simply by teaching students orthographic mapping. And what that means is, in our brains, we have file folders, and these file folders store different components of a word. So it's going to give us the spelling of a word, it's going to store the pronunciation of the word, and it's going to store the meaning of the word. And once you've stored those 3 pieces of information in your mental file folder, you will have memorized the word. So all we need to do is help kids create these little file folders, and they'll be able to memorize that word. So let's pretend that we are practicing the word can. We first want to have kids listen for the sounds that they hear in that word. So k, a, n. Okay, now they've heard that there are 3 individual sounds in that word can. Now we're going to have them connect each of those sounds to the letters that are used to spell them. So they would actually they'd say the sounds again, and now they're going to write the C, k, the A, and the N for N. And now they can say the word again and write it again, and then read the entire word. They'll do that 5 times. It's called sound mapping, and it's building that orthographic mapping. And once they do it 5 times, it's possible to memorize the word. That's all it takes. Instead of spending hours and hours drilling these sight words, they'll be able to memorize it really quickly and efficiently. So that is one example of so many examples I could give where, as teachers, we've been banging our heads against the desk trying to come up with a million different games that we need to play to help kids memorize these sight words, when really it could be as simple as just helping them hear the sounds in the words and connect those sounds to the letters they need.
And as you talk about that orthographic mapping, I think it's so important to point out, you pointed out those sounds. They hear those separate phonemes, right? They map out those sounds, and to recognize that there's a developmental progression there, right? That we're not starting with our toddlers in sound mapping, right? Because first it's the phonemic awareness that you talked about. So for those that are teaching toddlers and early preschoolers, depending on where they are developmentally, we're really just pouring into that phonological awareness and the concepts of prints, those basic emergent literacy concepts. We can't just jump in with sound mapping if we haven't built a foundation of phonological awareness. And while that phonological awareness is ongoing, even as we start to build those greater skills, so we don't want to pretend that it's something that we just check off with 3-year-olds. We keep building that. But I think it's so important for early childhood educators in particular to recognize that we have to build those foundational pieces before we jump into those next ones. So for those that are listening that are thinking, my kiddos are not ready for sound mapping, they may not be, right? But it's an important piece to know about so that you know that you're building the foundation that prepares them to build up to that piece as well. Are there things that early childhood educators need to understand about that developmental spread as they look at literacy?
I think you hit on so much of it. So continuing to make it developmentally appropriate and not push kids beyond the point where their brain is actually ready to learn that information. It'll prevent frustration for you. It'll prevent overwhelm for them. And I love the reminder to always make things fun and active and hands-on. The first thing that comes to mind is syllable segmenting. So when we're taking a word like elephant and we're breaking it into these syllables, elephant, we could just practice it with our words, or we could make it a really active activity where kids are tapping out the sounds on their arms. They tap the first syllable on top of their hand, and they tap their elbow for the second syllable, and then their shoulder for the third. So when we say elephant, we're actually tapping it. Or maybe we take the word elephant and we stomp around the room, practicing breaking that word into syllables. We can make all of this really fun, really engaging and motivating for kids. It does not have to be boring, and kids are actually going to learn better when it's not boring, when it is active.
Absolutely. And that touches on something I wanted to ask you about. I think for some people, they hear research-based or science, and they're thinking that's not for me because I believe in play-based approaches to early childhood. So I think for some people, there's this dichotomy. You can't have research and science if you want to be play-based, when really the research will tell you how important play is, like you're saying. Are there other things that you think of when it comes to marrying together the ideas of a play-based approach and a research-based approach? For you, how do those things fit together? Maybe for those that are having a hard time realizing that they fit together, where a research-based approach can also be a play-based approach. They can happen at the same time.
I'll use the sound mapping example I gave just a minute ago. So we could think of very boring sound mapping where we're just saying the word, tapping out the sounds k, a, n, and writing the letters, right? Or we could think about some more hands-on and playful ways to work on that. So maybe we grab a container of Play-Doh and we have kids actually roll balls of Play-Doh for each sound they hear. So they roll a ball for k, they roll a ball for a, they roll a ball for n, and now they go back and say those same sounds again, but they get to squish the Play-Doh balls as they go. Or maybe we give them a set of Matchbox cars and we have them roll these little Matchbox cars. Each time they hear a new sound, they're rolling the Matchbox cars. Or we give them Lego bricks and they place each Lego brick. I think manipulatives can be really fun because it's a great way to connect what kids are interested in, their favorite toy, for example, and bring it into the learning space so that they feel like their learning is more play than it is work.
Yeah. And I think, like I mentioned before, there's first of all that realization that the research tells us they learn better when they're in a playful state. It literally changes the brain. And then just the realization as well that, like we mentioned before, so much of this is playing with sounds. And while we are looking at this research and we're finding how to help them play with the sounds in an effective way, once we model and play with them, it's interesting to me to watch children then playing with sounds on their own, right? You've maybe done this Play-Doh activity in more of a small group setting, but then you see them at their centers doing the exact same activity. I think that's just always a good sign that this is fun for them if they choose to play with it on their own as well, to do that same sort of playing with sounds. Children love to play with sounds. We just need to show them lots of different ways that we can do that as well. Are there other things that you think of? We've talked about some of these practices that teachers can improve with, some ways they can integrate play and research. Are there some practices that you would love to just see put back on the shelf that we could just either improve and do them differently, or maybe just stop putting our time into those types of practices and focus on something else? What are some of those ineffective practices that you're seeing in the classrooms?
I'm going to give you three. And we talked about this throughout our chat already, but it's so important that we remain developmentally appropriate for kids' needs. And even in a classroom of 12 or 15, there are going to be a variety of learning needs, and kids are going to be on a continuum of readiness for all of these skills. So it's really important that we do not overwhelm students who are not ready to dive into phonics, or they're not ready to sound map words yet. Meeting them where they are at is always good practice. And so that's number one. And then number two, sight words. I talked about this earlier. I know in especially 4-year-old classrooms, there can be a push to get kids kindergarten ready. And so in some programs, there's this expectation that students will memorize 20 words by the end of the year, for example. And it's really important that we look at those sight word lists and, first of all, see if they're developmentally appropriate, because they may not be. But secondly, if at all possible, we need to connect those sight words to the phonics rules that are actually being taught. So don't teach them in isolation. One example is in that story I was telling you about my daughter. She had 5 different words that she had to memorize that week. So the words were and, the, to, can, and for. If you look at those 5 different words, they use very different phonics skills. So you're having to teach the or sound in for right next to the and, the short a sound in and, right? So it would be a lot for any brain to try and wrap their head around all of that. But when you are working with a brand new reader, it's especially overwhelming and daunting. So if you can take your list and sort it by phonics skill, maybe you practice all of your short a words one week and you're working on and or can, and practice those over many weeks, and then move on to your next set of words. It will make a big difference for kids. So that's number 2. And then number 3, emergent reader books, those leveled reader books that we have relied on for so long, especially with brand new readers. We now know that those books are not based sequentially on any scope and sequence that makes sense to our brains. They're kind of, they were ranked based on the number of words on a page, or whether those pictures were matching the words that you see, or if the text was repeating. So take a look at your books that you're giving kids and asking them to practice reading, and think to yourself, do these words, can my students, have they been taught the skills that they need to actually sound out these words, or are they just guessing these words? And if they're just guessing the words, then consider adding some decodable. They're called decodable text, but it basically means decode. So you're able to look at the letters and break the code and sound them out. Take a look at decodable text and consider replacing them.
Is there anything else that we haven't been able to touch on yet? I mean, you have an entire book, so there's obviously a lot more, but is there anything else that you're burning to share for early childhood educators who are, really just setting that foundation for our youngest learners? We know how important those experiences are for them. Is there anything else that you want them to know about the science of reading?
I hope the biggest takeaway is that there are so many things in your classroom that are actually incredibly effective for kids. So keep doing those things. And then there are going to be some things that are not as effective, and take the time to learn about the research so that you are able to be empowered to help all of your learners, especially those struggling readers who are going to need some extra pieces and some extra support. We now have the knowledge at our fingertips. All you have to do is learn it, and you'll be able to take your teaching to the next level and really have a significant, powerful impact on the next generation.
I think that's such a great piece of encouragement and advice. I hope that teachers, as they study what's in your book and the other things that they find, that they realize there's a lot of that already happening in their classrooms in these simple things, and that they can just bring more intention, more awareness, and just do the best for these young learners. There are a lot of places where people can find you. Where else would you recommend people start if they want to learn more about this work that you're doing?
So 3 different places. Number 1 is I'm on Instagram, and I share a ton of science of reading content over there. So if you are inspired to learn more, find me there. It's at Play-Doh2, the number 2, Plato, Plato. You also can grab my book, The Science of Reading in Action. My goal with this book was to make sure that you could get all of the knowledge you needed and the tools you needed in one spot. So I want quick wins for you. And then finally, if you want to join my 4-week training so you can become a master level reading teacher, I'd love to see you inside the Reading Roadmap.
So great. And I love your examples on Instagram of these literacy-based, play-based activities. I've used several of them. They're great examples of how you can match together the research about reading and hands-on playful activities that children really enjoy doing as they play with words and play with sounds. So thank you for the work that you're doing and sharing with our youngest learners and sharing with these educators and parents who love them so much. And I just appreciate the work you're doing to help people, help children in better and better ways.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I'm thrilled that I hopefully have been able to provide some help to your community.
Thanks again for listening to Not Just Cute, the podcast. You can find show notes at notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 58. There you'll find links to the books and courses we discussed today, as well as other fascinating tidbits I know you'll love. You can also hit up the show notes for a link to the Why We Play letters. Head to notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 58, or go straight to notjustcute.com/why we play to get signed up and download your free sample letter. The Why We Play letters will help you start conversations and advocate for developmentally appropriate, play-based early education. I'm Amanda Morgan. You can read more on my blog and sign up for the Not Just Cute newsletter at notjustcute.com. You can also stay tuned for social media updates on Instagram by following me at Amanda_NotJustCute. Thanks for listening today, and as always, thank you for standing up for children and for childhood.